Welcome to the WellCast. The world has a lot to say. We're bringing a biblical perspective to those conversations.
We are back for another episode in this World Religions series, the WellCast, coming at you. It's me, Jordan, and I'm joined by the Balded Wonder, Mr. Mike Sarasoni.
The Balded Wonder.
The Balded, at least I didn't say eagle.
That might be my superhero name.
And for all those joining over video, Mike has a story about my
Yeah, we went out to lunch today
sweatshirt
before we recorded this episode. And
Fat Burger.
We went to Fat
Sponsor
Burger.
us.
By the way, really good burger here in Fresno.
Pretty decent.
I was really impressed by it. But Jordan accidentally dipped his strings on his sweatshirt in the ketchup and didn't know for a good probably 30 minutes.
It's a red sweatshirt.
It's a red sweatshirt. And so the strings...
I was just Jackson Pollocking the front of this sweatshirt. With
the strings basically put a smiley face on his sweatshirt in ketchup. And
I was very impressed with myself because I'm a pretty messy eater. That was a pretty messy burger.
Yeah, and you got into my truck and you looked down and you went, uh-oh.
Oh, dang it.
And
I thought about leaving it and just being like, maybe. But then I just decided to wash it off. And then I had a giant water stain.
Yeah. But in our new studio, there's a dryer.
There's a washer and a dryer.
Yes. So,
and our beautiful podcast producers had the wonderful idea of throwing it in there.
And so thus he is wearing his ketchup sweatshirt.
Yeah. All clean for the most part. We're good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might catch some ants on this thing because I didn't really wash it off, but residual shigs.
All clean until dinner.
Yeah. So anyways, that's an introduction to me as a person.
That's right. You get to
and Mike and I's relationship.
You get to know Jordan a little bit.
So, we're in the middle of this world religions deal. We're actually kind of, almost through. We have a couple more episodes after this one, but today we are tackling the second largest monotheistic religion in the world, being Islam.
That sounded like Goliath.
It is. There are 25% of the world's population's estimated claim Islamic belief.
Yeah. 1.28 billion people worldwide. And so we're going to talk about this. This is another Middle Eastern religion. We talked about Judaism last episode, and so now we're getting into Islam. And our goal with all of these episodes is really to kind of give you a taste for them.
Yeah,
like we're not writing our thesis on these religions. We're not doctors of apologetics. Like we're just trying to give you a little taste of each religion, understand a little bit about what they believe, and then really have the conversation as Christians. How do we share the truth that we believe about Jesus? How do we share that with each faith, each type of religion?
Yeah, the goal is not that we'd be exhaustive, right?
Yeah.
Because we're Christian pastors, and so we claim Jesus. I think it's important that we have at least a starting knowledge of other faiths so that when we interact with our neighbors who Jesus has called us to love, we're able to meet them where they're at and have a sense of understanding.
Yeah, so our hope is that as we dive into this episode on Islam, that you really just walk away with a beginning of a hope to understand what Muslims believe and how you can better equip yourself to enter into their lives, love them well, and share Jesus with them.
Yeah, so in contrast to Judaism, which was the last one we did,
it's a very old religion.
Islam is the youngest major monotheistic religion, right? Yeah. And it found its origins in the 6th century with the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, so technically the 7th century, so 622 AD.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah, it's all right. It's a common mistake.
I forget about the fact that you're supposed to go.
The first century didn't exist. So 622 AD is really the founding of the religion of Islam, and it found its roots in the prophet, the believed prophet of God named Muhammad, who lived from 570 to 632 AD. So it's all things considered, I know that seems like a very long time ago, but all things considered, it's one of the youngest. It is the youngest major religion in the world.
Major monotheistic religion, yeah. And I think in contrast with Judaism as well, it is very evangelistic. It is very missional oriented.
Yeah, the goal is for everyone in the world to be Muslim, and so it absolutely is, and it has spread from the Middle East. And we've already talked about how there's over 1.25 billion people worldwide that are Muslim, but it's spread across continents. So you've got the Middle East largely, pretty much outside of Judaism. The Middle East is a stronghold for
The Islamic faith,
Islam,
yeah.
and then you've got North Africa. You've got even some of the Far Eastern countries, even down in the islands, down in
that was
Eastern
one
Asia.
of the things. Almost 70% of Southeast Asia is Islamic.
Yeah.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. So it is very evangelistic. It is spreading, and so I want for us to talk about this religion and understand what they believe, and then how is that different than Christianity? What are the major differences, and then how do we enter in? So let's talk a little bit about what they believe. The first thing we should talk about is this their prophet Muhammad, right?
Yeah.
So a little history on him. Jordan, tell us a little bit about who he is, his history, and how he came to found the Islamic faith.
Well, Muhammad is in the Islamic faith sort of, you can't really talk about Muhammad without talking about the Quran. And so he is sort of the first restoration prophet, right? And so he's highly, highly revered. I think Muslims would tell you that he is not a Messiah in the same way that Jesus is. He's not to be worshipped.
Right.
It is that line is hard to differentiate sometimes,
Right.
of reverence and worship, but they would say that he is simply a prophet, right? And that he did die. He didn't rise from the dead or anything like that. But he was given the Quran by God, which is the word of God.
Yeah. And so then in 622, which I mentioned earlier, which really isn't the founding of the faith, but it's kind of the starting of the founding of the faith. He preached vigorously against paganism, and so he had to flee the city that he was in, and then in 630 A.D. he returned and had a big military victory there. And that place is called Mecca, which is a very important place in the Islamic faith. And it's there in Mecca that he established Islam as the religion of all Arabia. So that's a huge part of their history. This is the origin story of Islam.
Yeah, he was a leader to begin with, right? And people may not have known that before, the Middle East before Muhammad was largely either, influenced by Christianity, Judaism, or the polytheistic religions of the ancient Near East.
Yeah, and what you're going to notice as we walk through some of the beliefs about Islam or in Islam is there are a lot of similarities between the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and the Islamic faith. I mean, there are a lot of vast differences, which we'll get into also, but you're going to notice a lot of them. So, for instance, when you talk about the Quran, the Quran is believed, or the tradition, the Islamic tradition, is that the Quran was dictated in Arabic by the angel Gabriel, which should ring a bell to you. I mean, the archangel Gabriel that's in the Bible. To Muhammad, and that those words that Gabriel passed on to Muhammad were God's exact words, like you mentioned.
Yeah, those who listen to the Mormon episode is very similar to sort of the
Joseph Smith.
Yeah, Joseph Smith, where he was given the exact words of God, Scripture, nothing, of his own accord, things like that. That's the claim, at least, right? And I think if we want to get into the Quran, we can. But you'll find that the Quran has very many of the same Old Testament characters.
Yeah.
Moses, you'll find in there. like you said, Gabriel, Jesus, you'll even find in there.
Yep. And we'll get into some of that stuff as we talk through some of the similarities. But yeah, the Quran is believed to contain the Sharia law, the perfect law of God, and passed down through Muhammad. And so
the Quran and the Hadith, right?
The Hadith, yeah.
And the Hadith is a sort of those who are observers and recorders of the life and sayings of Muhammad, and they wrote that down in the Hadith. And so we're going to do our best. What we found in so just asterisk or come on, is there is a huge wide variety within Islam.
Yes.
And each one of those traditions has also their own sort of interpretations of the Quran.
Right.
Has their own sort of commentary texts, their own even religious rulers who have given their own interpretations of these things.
Yeah, so as much as possible, we're going to try and lay out kind of the orthodox stuff that's pretty common in the different views. But we do, that's the asterisk, right? There are a lot of different things.
Honestly, if we were to chronicle all of Judaism, all of Islam, this would be an 8-hour long, at least, podcast.
Right. And so, obviously there's a Western view of Islam, historical view of Islam that we're not going to get a ton into as far as, some of the extremist things that have happened to our country. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is talking about specifically what are the theological beliefs of Islam and how do we as Christians now enter in, because the goal is not to disagree with a religion, right? That's not the goal. Like, we have greater calling, which is to share Jesus, to love them the way that God loves them, and to hope that they find salvation through Jesus Christ. So that's our hope.
Yeah. So we get back to the Quran.
Yeah.
When I went to India, I was working a lot. Actually, you may not know, there are large Muslim populations in India.
Yeah.
It's majority Hindu and Sikh, but it is there are Muslim populations. And I bought a Quran when I was in India that was written in English and Arabic, and I read it for the first time. And I was struck by, so I was used to reading the Bible, and the Bible has like a large amount of narrative, and a lot of those narratives are really complete, right? So there's, beginning and ending stories, there's large story arcs, things like that. And that's not really, if you pick up a Quran, that's not really how it's structured. I would probably, if you're familiar with the book of Proverbs, I would say it's probably very similar to Proverbs. There's even like in the Quran endings of stories. And I remember just reading it, and I actually read it while I was in India and on the way home, and had some great conversations on the plane based on that, being a Christian who's reading the Quran. And I read through the whole thing, and it's actually kind of hard to read. Because I think there's only really, if I remember correctly, really only 1 or 2 full stories. And it reads much more like Proverbs or teachings or lessons than it does narrative arcs.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and so we talked a little bit, about in the last episode about moralistic undertones in a lot of the different, faith traditions. Mostly, we pointed out in the last episode that really grace is the undertone of Christianity, but in a lot of other religions, it's adherence to the law that's handed down, and the Quran is that law. And from the Quran, Muslims get this picture of what it looks like to fulfill or satisfy the will of Allah, which is God, and they call those things the 5 pillars. And so I thought we'd walk through the 5 pillars a little bit, have a little conversation about them. But the first of the 5 pillars is the confession of faith. And this is the declaration that
you've probably heard it before.
Yeah, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet. And so that's where everything starts for the Muslim.
It is the first word spoken to an Islamic baby and once born. It's said every day in prayers. It's said in their deathbed. It's the cornerstone of their sort of like worldview.
Yeah, and it has to be held until death for the hope of salvation.
Well, and just sort of a side note, these are all, the 5 pillars are leading to a complete life.
Yeah.
And even there's a lot of disagreement in the structure of the afterlife, But what is agreed is that there is a heaven, there is a hell, to where that's not always the case in things like Judaism,
Yeah, sure.
and Mormonism and things like that. Even when it comes to heaven, the structure of that, there could be different levels based on the pillars and based on what you have completed. And then they even have sort of sub-interpretations of how you fulfill these pillars that they would call fatwas.
Yeah.
And those are like, sub-laws of the laws. And those could contribute to other ways that you experience paradise.
Well, and with the caveat that if you reject this first pillar, there is no salvation.
Yeah, this is the gateway to everything.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you reject the confession of faith, then there is no salvation.
This might be like your Southern Baptist. I went up for an altar call.
I've never been Southern Baptist before, but I have a great admiration for a lot of.
I think I went forward about 10 times as a kid.
Did you raise your hand when you were
super covered?
3 years old?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's how.
A lot of hellfire and brimstone. We'll get into that to another episode.
That sounds like a you story that I can't wait to hear.
You can talk to me or with permission, my therapist. So we've got confession of faith.
Yes. So confession of faith. The second pillar is prayer. So tell us a little bit about kind of the Islamic view of prayer.
Prayer is 5 times a day traditionally, right? And you pray with the rug facing Mecca.
Okay.
And there are certain actual movements and words that are designed to center you around this prayer practice that have been basically they're largely monolithic across all of Islam.
Yeah, and they're usually led in mosques. Even though there's not like a priesthood in Islam, they have respected lay leaders that lead these mosques.
Yeah.
And they typically lead these 5 prayer times a day. And those prayer times are before sunrise, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and before bed. And so those are the 5 prayer times, like you said, facing Mecca for the second pillar of prayer.
Yeah. The third being almsgiving. So the third pillar, actually I was short of some sort of payment when I was in India, and a man in his sort of version of English that he had learned, he was conversational, but I was short on paying for something. And a Muslim man offered to give me alms. Oh. So I was like a fulfillment of this for a guy.
That's like the times where we go out to lunch and I offered to buy your lunch for you.
It was very kind of him and you. But there is a sort of a overarching idea that you would give at least 2.5% of your capital wealth to the poor, and with Muslim organizations and institutions, especially ones that propagate Islam. Yeah,
and what's interesting, because we talked about how this is one of the major Middle Eastern religions, Christianity and Judaism being the other two. This is similar to, especially the way that the Jewish people would view the tithe. Right? It's not as much. It's 2.5%. But it is tied to obedience to Allah, right? This third pillar of the faith. And so you're seeing, again, a lot of similarities between the Middle Eastern religions. Obviously, Christianity, the tithe is not necessarily, a lot of people think that there's a tithe in the New Testament, but there's not.
Yeah.
There's
idea,
generosity, the principle of generosity and being someone who realizes that everything belongs to God.
Yeah.
But here it's specifically tied to salvation, or like you said, the experience of the afterlife.
And there's a sort of a categorization of different parts of your life. And I thought, as in reading in alms, one of the things that this is believed to do is to, in some ways, no matter how your wealth is gained, it atones your wealth.
Yeah. So it purifies or atones that. That's good. The fourth pillar of Islam is something that just me saying it is going to convict some Christians out there, but it's the fast, the idea of fasting, right?
Yeah.
So during the course of the lunar month of Ramadan, a fast is to be observed by every Muslim from sunrise to sunset. So nothing is to pass over the lips during this time, and they should refrain from any physical intimacy with their spouse.
You know what was so interesting about this was growing up on my block, there was 2 Muslim families at the end of the street.
Yeah.
During like my more sort of formative years, 11 to 18 or so, and there was this was one of my favorite months of the year.
Yeah.
Because they were very hospitable.
Yeah.
And they invited any of the families or kids who wanted to come for the breaking of the fast every day.
Yeah.
And dude, we ate so good.
Yeah.
They hadn't eaten all day, so they probably
were
enjoyed
really
it more than
hungry.
me. But
Yeah.
I literally was like, dude, can't wait for Ramadan. We're gonna eat so much hummus and all these delicious chickens and beefs and all these things.
Plus,
And
you probably got to eat their lunch, like at school.
I don't think they packed one.
No,
But
that's
it was
good.
awesome, yeah.
Yeah, and so this month is used to remember the giving of the Quran to Muhammad. That's
Yeah.
what the month of Ramadan is all about.
There's a lot of discipline involved in this in Islam.
Yeah, I have a hard time missing. Sometimes I don't ever forget that I ate lunch. I forget that I ate lunch and then eat another one. I said that wrong.
You're like a hobbit.
I don't ever forget that I
What
forget
about
to eat
second
lunch. Yeah.
Or first dinner.
Anyway, I wish I would have said that right the first time.
It's okay. I redeemed you with my hobbit.
Thank you. I'm a hobbit.
So last,
Yeah, the fifth
and
pillar.
one that's probably known but not necessarily known in this category is that there is a pilgrimage aspect to salvation. In that there's an expectation that all Muslims would be able to make their way to Mecca on a pilgrimage at some point during their life.
Yeah, and so as you go to Mecca, it is the holiest site of Islam, and so it's important for you as a Muslim to make this pilgrimage one time.
You've probably seen pictures of in the Great Mosque in Mecca, the huge black square.
Yeah,
And that was supposed to be where Muhammad had purged the idols of the pagans there, and that was like the established first worship place.
yeah. And what's interesting about holy sites, this is kind of a cul-de-sac, an aside, but
Sure,
I've
that's
been
what we do here.
I've been to Israel, and on the Temple Mount, which is the holy site of Judaism, right, and Christianity. You know, as we think about the Old Testament. Is the Dome of the Rock, which is a holy site for the Muslims. And so there's this one site in Israel that is now it's in contention, and the top of the Temple Mount is run by Muslims and overseen by Israel. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, you could see why that would be pretty politically charged.
It's problematic. Yeah. And we weren't, they patrol it and they make sure you don't teach the Bible on the top of the Temple Mount. We got around it, but yeah, it was fascinating to see this one place in biblical history and Islamic history come together, and it was fascinating.
I remember walking around and feeling palpable tension.
Yeah.
Palpable tension.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can get through this as fast as possible, but there's an elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
As a sort of Western experience of Islam, that there is an extremist. Let's say we back up and we look at all religion, all faith walks.
Yeah.
And I would say a majority, if not all, have some sort of extreme expression within them, right?
Right. At least at some point in history.
Yeah. And so I think, the Western experience of Islam, geopolitically as well as religiously, has been one of most of the pictures of Islam we get are extreme. And what we typically categorize as terrorism, which would be Islamic extremist groups, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Or even oppression of the female gender, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I think Mike and I were talking about this, and it is deeply our heart that we would not sort of propagate Islamophobia
Yeah.
in any way. Because even if there was something to fear directly, I think the Bible's pretty clear. We're teaching through Joshua right now.
Right.
With God, man, we don't have to fear anybody.
Yeah.
And so, but I would just be interested in us having a small sort of side conversation about how do we think about this, and how do modern Muslims think about this?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think it's really hard to get around the fact that there are problematic texts in the Quran, but we have to be humble enough to go, okay, there are also problematic texts in especially the Old Testament, right? You know, and so I think we give them some grace as we seek to understand how they reconcile problematic texts with their faith. You know, because a lot of Muslims, especially here in America, would categorize Islam as a peaceful religion.
Yeah.
And I think we have to have those conversations with them to say, hey, help me understand, right? Because you say this and I see this in your Quran. Help me understand. And I think we can bridge a lot of gaps by just that one question or one statement. Help me understand. But I do think that there are other places in the world where there are more of an extreme perspective. Places like Iran.
You know, you would go to places like Saudi Arabia, and they would say that to behead a homosexual is honoring to God.
Yeah.
And it is a part of their law. And then I would have friends here who are Islamic who would say that is not honoring to God, and that is terrible. So I think the first acknowledgement is that even within Islam, there is not a consensus on how you read and interpret these scriptures.
Yeah.
I think obviously it gets very confusing when you say that this is the direct, infallible, immutable word of God delivered by an angel.
Yeah.
It's tough to say that there's a lot of interpretability.
Yeah.
But I think you have to acknowledge that there are Muslims who would say, like, we don't believe that that's the truth.
Right.
And they do with all their heart not want to hurt other people.
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that I would challenge a Muslim or an Islamic brother and sister to really think about would be to ask yourself, look, yes, in Christianity, we do have to wrestle with these things. But then we also have Jesus, who's the exact image of God, who is the representation of the invisible God, who says, love your neighbor like yourself, who says, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other one, who is the way of peace. And he helps us to then look at the Old Testament and look at the Old Covenants and say, here's how we now look at these things and how God interacts with his people differently now. They don't have that interpretive method now. Mm-hmm. There is the Quran.
Yeah.
And there is no later revelation of the Quran.
Right.
And so I would simply just ask them to wrestle with the fact that, like, look, in Christianity, we'd say, yeah, there's been extremists who have used the Bible for violence.
Yeah.
But they have done that wrongly.
Mm-hmm. And
then there are extremists who have used the Quran for let me think how to word this. There are extremists who have taken the words of God in the Bible and used it and twisted it in order to create violence. Mm-hmm. I think in Islam, you have to take the words of Muhammad or God, if that's your view,
literally, and you
have to take it and twist it in order to make it peaceful.
Yeah.
And so you can do that, but we have to acknowledge that there are places where these things are used for oppression today.
Yeah.
And there are places where it is used to hurt people. And so I think the best thing you can do is to ask your friends what they think about that and how they view those texts. And what does it mean to them that, that their religion started largely as a warring religion.
Yeah.
And where are they at today, And truly the modern expression of Islam did not necessarily start in its peaceful forms until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these narratives of the religion of peace weren't talked about this way until some of those pieces of power started falling.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't really honestly know how to go about that in ways that feels like, because I've had conversations with my Muslim friends, and most of the time it's just like, well, that's not how we view that. And it's okay, like, so is that, what did God mean in those cases?
Yeah.
Because those people who took those words literally ended up doing that, and it ended up being very detrimental and destructive.
Well, and we're going to get in just a few minutes, we're going to get into how we talk about our faith with our Muslim, friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good starting point, is just asking questions.
Yeah.
Like if this is what this says,
Mm-hmm.
how do you get to where you believe based
Yeah.
off of what this says? And I think that's a good starting point. And then you just ask the question, because I do think we have to deal with it. But,
Yeah.
But I think we have a misguided understanding of what our response to that should be as Christians. So it's so easy for us to see something that we view as violent, whether it is or isn't, is matter of
and
conversation.
I want people to hear that I'm not willing to concede that it's just inherently a violent religion.
Yeah.
Because I think, I don't know, things change over time.
Yeah.
And it may have been, it may not be now, or it may be now.
It is in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
You can't get away around that. But whether it's inherently violent or not doesn't change our response to it. Because our response as Christians has to be compassion and love and kindness, no matter what somebody else believes.
Yeah.
We don't have to agree with it. That's different. But we do have to have compassion and love and kindness towards them, because that's somebody created in the image of God. They may be outside of His will. They may not be following the way that He would want or we would want them to. They may be misguided in where they place their hope or their faith, but God still loves them. And our response sometimes is we hear about things and we hate the people instead of hating the fact that they're misguided and that they're not.
Yeah, and you think about the
following
story of the
truth.
New Testament, right? That's a story of like a people living within a terrorizing regime.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is the seedbed of our faith.
Yeah.
And that the people's adherence to loving those people radically around them and their neighbors is what grew our faith.
Yeah.
And so someone like Paul, who was literally terrorizing the early church, God in His mercy saw fit to save him and knock him off his horse and blind him, and saying, I love you, Paul. I love you, Saul. I am going to change your name into Paul. I'm going to call you to my name, and then I'm going to use you, who were the worst of worst, who killed my people, who, held coats as as a disciple of Christ was being stoned. I think, like, that's the person I'm going to use. And so I would just encourage, keep the mind of the early church, keep the mind of those believers in the world who are loving the people around them who are violent toward them still.
Yeah.
In the church around the world globally.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about there are three main ideas that or questions about Christianity that Muslims would have. And I want to equip our people, if they're going to share their faith with Muslims, what they should know, some of the critiques that they may have, some questions or objections to Christianity. So the first is the Trinity, right? So they would say, I don't want to say all of them would say, but most of them would say that isn't the Trinity a belief in three gods, right?
Yeah, and usually it's a misconception from any Islamic friend I've had.
Right.
Has said that it's God, Jesus, and Mary.
Yeah.
And I think that's that's kind of our Catholic brothers and sisters' fault in some ways, because that's their experience of who they see on the walls.
Yeah.
But that's what I've heard before.
Well, and even the concept of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit is one God in three persons.
Yeah.
And so it can be confusing even to Christians, right?
Yeah.
It can be really hard. I mean, that's one of the easiest ways to say heresy without actually trying to say heresy is to talk about the Trinity, right?
Yeah.
Because it's something so unfathomable to the human mind.
Yeah.
Like it's so easy for us to have a misconception of it.
Well, even if you're talking to your Muslim friend, you have to realize that as a Christian, their just view of God, even Old Testament wise, if you're looking back at who God is in the Old Testament, you feel like Jesus isn't the full revelation yet, all these things, right? And you see the Spirit, but it's not indwelling. And the fact that God would be personally invested in the well-being of humans is an other thought in Islam.
Yeah.
God is wholly other. Even concepts of sin in Islam it doesn't grieve God because we cannot affect God. In Christianity, our sin is a rebellion that grieves God, right? The Islamic worldview is that God is holy, he is other, and the only way that he has contact with us is through his agents. And we have no effect or bearing upon him in our actions.
Right.
And, while we would say that, like, yeah, we can't hurt God technically, but he is invested in us because he loves us and loves us personally. And even the Philippians 2 idea that God would then come to earth and be put on human flesh and be among us is like, you're talking to a person who can't even well, that's just not how God is.
Yeah.
That's not his character. That's not, he can't be here in our place.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it does. And so, as we're talking through some of these objections, our hope is just, like I said, to equip you and get you to start thinking about how you would answer somebody.
Yeah, I would also not start with the Trinity.
Yeah, that might be
that could be pretty tough.
Well, here's another one. So they might ask, how can Jesus be the Son of God? So Jesus is one of the similarities between Islam and Christianity.
Yeah, Jesus is in the Quran.
He is in the Quran, and he's believed to be a prophet.
Yeah.
Or a prophet of God. And so he has a place. That's the one thing that I want our listeners to know. Jesus has to be dealt with in every kind of Western religion.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with them. We saw that the Mormon Church deals with Jesus in a different way than now the Muslim faith deals with Jesus. So there has to be something to be dealt with because he is historically an accurate figure who made some bold claims and did some bold things and has to be dealt with.
Is he who he says he is? At least in the Christian perspective, right? I think one interesting thing that I found in research is I didn't know that the Quran teaches that he was born to a virgin. But that doesn't mean he's God. They just don't. They're like, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, and the purpose of that is not questioned.
Yeah.
But we know that the purpose of this supernatural conception is that way he would be both fully God and fully human. And so the answer, how can Jesus be the Son of God, is the virgin birth. Like it is the virgin birth that he is both fully God in his deity from being the Son of God and fully human, which comes in from his human mother. And so that's an essential understanding of why the virgin birth is so essential.
Well, the question of Jesus is where I would probably just continue to walk with my Muslim friends. In any place where I've ever felt any actual leeway or that they were leaning towards Christ was in conversations about Jesus, because they start from a place of reverence, where your atheistic friends would not, right?
Yeah.
And similar to Mormons, that they start from a place of reverence. But similar to the Mormon religion, you have to ask, well, who is he?
Yeah.
What did he do? And what was the purpose of his life? And so, Islam would say, he's revered. He was born of a virgin. He was actually sinless. He's the only sinless person ever. And he never died. He was taken to paradise, and that he will come back in judgment.
Which is that brings us to the next objection, which is how could Jesus have died on the cross if he's the Son of God? So the Muslim faith would tell you that Jesus never died on the cross, but that he was substituted on the cross, that God took him off the cross and put Judas up there in his place. And so it's interesting the fact that especially if he's God's son, which is an interesting thing because they don't believe that. I thought it was
kind of funny that they had said, I think the Quran says that he hid until the third day. I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah. That and so we start to walk through these questions of what's more plausible and what's recorded in history. I mean, you talked even today about Josephus, right?
Yeah, I think if I were going to nail down with a friend about, hey, is Jesus who he says he is? I think you have to focus on Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, and deity.
Yeah.
because they deny all three of those things.
Yep.
You can't have a resurrection if you didn't die, and then you can't be God if there's only one God.
Yeah.
Right. And so Jesus, if he, there is a profound amount of historical evidence
Yep.
for the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yeah.
And it is even more widespread than his resurrection, because that would not be a very beneficial thing for people to record if they did even not believe it or something.
Right, yeah.
But the, even like I said earlier, Josephus, who was a Hellenistic Jew, he was a historian. He wrote in his Antiquities about the resurrection or about the crucifixion of Jesus, right? This insurrectionist and would-be Messiah. And there is account after account in the not just Christian authors, but non-Christian authors in that time period that talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. There's a whole Jesus seminar of historians who don't believe that Jesus is God, but they are arguing for a view of Jesus that they almost unanimously agree that he died on the cross.
Yeah. Yeah. And a big problem that they have to wrestle with is what happened to his body afterwards. So you don't have to deal with that if there's not evidence that he was crucified.
Yeah.
But because there's evidence of his crucifixion and there's evidence that the tomb was empty, now you have to deal with, okay, how did that happen? If you don't believe he rose from the dead, you have to come up with other theories. And that's where we're not going to get into that in this episode, maybe a different episode, but that's where you come up with like the swoon theory, and where he kind of like almost died but didn't really, or that the somehow the disciples stole his body. All these theories that you have to deal with because of the historical accuracy of the crucifixion and the empty tomb. And so you have to deal with that, and so that is a good place to start.
Yeah, I think because it is truly a place where the writings of Muhammad and the Quran differ from the large section of historical evidence.
Well, and I think, as we've kind of talked through the deity of Jesus, the crucifixion and the resurrection being great places to maybe talk to Muslims who are open to hearing about the differences between Islam and Christianity, I think we have to approach those conversations with an understanding. And that understanding is this: it is not a small decision for a Muslim to convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
It is not like I was going to high school and I wasn't a Christian, and then my friend told me about the gospel, and so I was like, sure, well, I'll give it a try. It's not like that. Like, this is a life-altering, life or death decision for a lot of Muslims.
Yeah.
And so I think as we, you have some stories I'd love for you to share, at least in anonymity a little bit, but some stories of some relationships that you have where that's played out as people have converted from Islam to Christianity. I know if you're looking for a resource, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, Nabil Qureshi is such a good book, and it's basically his testimony of how God grabbed a hold of his heart as he was seeking Allah and practicing the Muslim faith, that Jesus showed up and showed how true he was. But then the path that he had to walk down of dealing with his family and what it looks like to be an apostate from the Islamic faith, it is not a small decision. And so we can't enter in with people thinking that they're just gonna convert on a whim.
Yeah.
It takes time and relationship and equity to be able to share Jesus with this people group.
I think, we've talked a lot about differences. We've talked a lot about like educational pieces. Obviously, if you want to know about Islam, there's an insane amount of information out there, and all the different sects and forms.
Be careful about Google, because not everything you read on the internet is true, but a lot of it is. Yeah,
with Christianity as well.
Yeah.
I would just say it's so different than when you're like, let's say you have an atheist friend who's American, third generation American from Ireland or something, and their family sort of has vaguely Catholic roots, but they're not really like a Christian, or maybe they're agnostic or an atheist. And The question is like, what's the cost, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you become a Christian, obviously some social circles collapse, and that's hard.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some people who think you're dumb, or there may be even extreme examples of families who are like, well, we're not going to invite them to this thing because they don't drink anymore, or they don't do these things, or which is not bad to just have drinks, but maybe not like you did before. And I want you to think and put yourself in the place of your Muslim brother or sister who, we talked a little bit about like the hadith and the Sharia and the laws, the things that govern their entire lives, the fatwas. I followed this account on Twitter, which is just like Muslim imams or priests that answer fatwa questions, which are like, is it okay to pray with a leather belt where you don't know the origins, or and they rule these fatwas of laws and things, and like this is literally their entire life.
Yeah.
And I mean, hopefully, as a Christian, this is your entire life,
Right.
But this will be in most cases a separation from their well-being, their support structures, the people who have loved and cared for them their whole lives, and those who not only loved them before will most likely hate them now.
Well, yeah, and in extreme circumstances, right? The extremist view is that anyone who is an apostate of the Islamic faith should be put to death.
There's a call for the blood atonement, right, of those who apostate, and that you atone for them by killing them and spilling their blood. I think I had a student who, I've had lots of Islamic students come through the ministry, and it is a nearly impossible wrestle for them to understand that, like, I'm wholly dependent on my family.
Yeah.
But I find a meaning and a call in this Jesus.
Yeah.
And they get involved in a community, loving community. And there's always a point where they have to decide, is this for me? Am I going to actually do this? And it's almost always baptism. It feels like a very finalized thing. And so I've only had one student go through that process, and we actually had to house them after that process because they were immediately kicked. There was a cousin of a cousin who came to the baptism, and they told the family, and they were immediately kicked out of their house, and then they were immediately had death threats put on their head by family who are in different countries.
Yeah.
And not only did we have to put them up in supportive housing for their senior year of high school, they then had to move and become more anonymous. Yeah. And we got them connected with a faith community that had a great support structure somewhere else. But I mean, how many of your Christian friends who found Jesus in some way had to go through that amount of painstaking hardship in order to make that decision?
Yeah.
And what I found was actually this student found a huge amount of support in the letters and writings of the early church.
Yeah.
Because their experience was so similar.
Yeah.
When Jesus said, like, it is not my goal to just destroy families, but this message will part people who love each other, who view these things differently.
Yeah.
And he promises that it will divide because it's so, so different.
Yeah.
And it's for some, it's a world apart.
Yep.
And so I've seen things like that. I mean, another story was when I was in India, one of the missionaries we stayed with, there was a girl staying there who, and this is kind of cool, and this is actually more common than you'd think in the Islamic world, but a girl Jesus had come to her in a dream, and she experienced him calling her to him, not knowing a lot about Jesus, and said, go to this market and seek this woman. And it ended up being a Christian missionary.
Wow.
And she sat down with her and said, well, Jesus is meeting you. And it was so crazy. This, Southern Baptist missionary, this old lady from the South was like, I had lady after lady who came up to me, told me that Jesus came to talk to them in their dreams, and I was like, this is amazing.
That's
and,
cool.
So
that's
she
really
was
cool. Terrible accent.
It was actually spot on. And she had said that this is a common thing, but then this girl needed to be immediately rehomed because if she was even considering this, she couldn't even go back home.
Yeah.
And so you have to consider the costs that you're asking. And then I think it also begs of the Christian church, are we creating systems to support people as they exit
Yep.
things that have been all life encompassing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode as we've talked through just, again, the basics.
And let me, real quick.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I know you're wrapping up, but I have to give one suggestion.
Ooh, this better be good.
Because I asked the same missionary, what is the defining principle of evangelism for you? And she said hospitality.
Yeah. Yeah.
She said, learn your people and love your people. And I believe it was in one of, what's his name?
Nabil
Qureshi. He was in one of his articles. He told the story about a Muslim student who came to America for a year from Saudi Arabia. He brought 2 full suitcases of gifts for families that would invite him into their homes. And he went home with 2 full suitcases because nobody ever invited him into their home.
Yeah.
Do not be afraid of these people. They are beautiful people. They want to know you. They want to be invited in your home. Even if they say no, it's a part of that. And then one of the things that the missionary told me was, don't be afraid to, Americans don't want to talk about politics and religion. She's like, that's all people in the Middle East talk about, politics and religion.
Yeah.
Just talk about it. Ask them about it. Ask them about their faith. You're not being rude. Be curious.
Yeah.
And when you invite them over, don't serve pork.
Right.
Like, be culturally sensitive. And ask them, don't serve wine to them because they don't drink alcohol. Like, be sensitive, get to know them, be curious, and be deeply hospitable because it's the only way these doors are going to open.
That's good, man. That was worthy of the interruption.
Okay.
So without further ado, we hope you've enjoyed this episode on Islam. We are continuing next time our series on world religions, and we hope you'll tune in. We also hope if you've enjoyed this episode, you share it, like it, send it out on social media, whatever you got to do to get the word out, because our hope is that that people can enjoy some of the stuff that we've been doing, and the same way that you did. So we'll see you next time on the WellCast. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the WellCast. As always, don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about us. For more information about the Well Community Church, visit thewellcommunity.org.